Hello everybody, welcome back to my divisional position rankings here between all four teams. We rank every single position and how they stack up against their rivals. Today we're looking at the NFC North, definitely a very competitive division, two new rookie quarterbacks amongst two that had exceptional years, some really great rosters. I think all of them have playoff aspirations this upcoming year, so should definitely be a fun division to take a look at. Let's just go ahead and get right into it, and I definitely think it starts with a controversial one, Jordan Love or Jared Goff. And I definitely think you can make the argument either way. Jared Goff's done it more consistently for a longer period of time. Jordan Love, the last 8 games of the season or so and into the playoffs, Jordan Love looked like arguably a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. So it just kind of depends on whether you believe in Jordan Love to keep that pace and that trajectory up in his first full season of starting after Aaron Rodgers moved on. Started off a little bit slow, but ultimately, he looked great down the stretch. And just because of how he finished off the year and his physical traits, his ability to come in and be successful in his de facto rookie year, I get it, he's been in the league for a long time, but his first real consistent starting experience, I was thoroughly impressed by him. I just see a slightly higher ceiling on him than I see in Jared Goff. So that is why ultimately Jordan Love is going to be number one for quarterbacks here. But I think you could make the argument either way. Goff had probably the best year of his career, took care of the football, was very efficient, was just so good, especially with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta. They got some targets in that room for Jared Goff to throw to, and he just operated the offense so well, so effectively, and put up some really fantastic numbers as well. So, I think those two are very clear-cut, the number one and number two, just at this point, because the other two starting quarterbacks will be rookies, but both of those guys are very close. I think they're both very arguably top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL right now. Then we go with the Bears at number 3. I do think that Caleb Williams obviously has a higher ceiling and higher floor than JJ McCarthy, who, was drafted later in the draft. He was ultimately the 10th pick, while Caleb Williams was the first. So I think that makes sense. I also had Caleb Williams rated much higher. I definitely believe that Williams was a great quarterback prospect. I don't know that he was like this generational type prospect that some people thought he was, but I still think he was well deserving of being the first overall pick. JJ McCarthy, I think, could definitely struggle in his first year if he even plays. Right now he's number 3 on the depth chart. I think that's very normal for rookies that, need some time to develop, and McCarthy does. But, Sam Darnold may play a lot of this year. That's going to put them at number 4. I know there'll be growing pains with Caleb Williams, but I definitely believe in the talent, and I think there'll be pains with the Vikings quarterback room regardless as well, even though I do really like the coaching and some of the weapons around him as well. So should be interesting to see, but I do think that that's how the quarterbacks stack up in the NFC North here. Then at running back, I am going to go with the Packers. I definitely think they switched around a lot of how this room looks. Aaron Jones was a long time, draft steal that they found late on day 3, and then ultimately turned into a great player for them. He had a lot of injuries that he dealt with last year, and so they replace him this year, and they go ahead and get Josh Jacobs to a big deal. And I really like that signing. I think he provides some, consistency. He consistently outperforms the blocking in front of him, which is not what you can say for many running backs. I didn't think his blocking was that amazing in Vegas, and he still was a very consistently good running back. So I'd say he's a top 8 or so running back in the NFL, and I think the Packers definitely upgraded in that position, even though I do really like Aaron Jones. Not to mention, you still have A.J. Dillon, who isn't great, but you have him, and then you drafted Marshawn Lloyd out of USC. He is somebody that needs to work on the fumbles. That was my biggest concern coming out of USC for him. He had a ton of them. I also think that, there's some issues breaking tackles at times, but this dude is big, he's explosive, and he definitely provides kind of that lightning element to Josh Jacobs' kind of thunder. So I like that duo. You've got A.J. Dillon still on the roster as well. That's going to be good enough for number 1 in this division. Then at number 2, we do have the Lions. Jahmyr Gibbs really turned into a great player for them. I will admit I was skeptical. I didn't love the pick at all. I think that it was still early for, a running back that isn't going to be your necessarily consistent true bell cow back, but he did provide a true level of explosiveness and just dynamic ability out of the backfield, and he was really, really good. And then you got David Montgomery, obviously got him over from the Bears, and he had a very productive season. He was kind of a touchdown machine, so that's a really nice 1-2 duo as well for this team. You've also got Craig Reynolds, you drafted Sion Vaki, so they've got some depth in that room as well. And then we're going to go with the Vikings. They move on from Alexander Mattison, who was pretty terrible. He was maybe the worst starting running back in the NFL last year, but they go ahead and replace him with the aforementioned Aaron Jones from the Packers. So if he can stay healthy, I think this is a really good signing. I do think that there's still question marks about that, but you have Ty Chandler. There's not a lot of depth on this roster. Dwayne McBride was a pick that I did like last year out of UAB, so I think maybe he turns into something, but it's not a very deep running back room, unlike kind of the Bears, who we also have here. Khalil Herbert, you've got Roshan Johnson. There's quite a few guys in this room that are decent players, and I think you could argue that the kind of collective unit of those couple of guys, DeAndre Swift, who you signed in free agency as well. I wasn't the biggest fan of the DeAndre Swift signing, but you've got Travis Homer. It's kind of a 4-deep running back room. I think Aaron Jones is the best of those 5 guys, but you've got kind of a committee backfield in Chicago that I think could be pretty successful as well. So I wouldn't be mad if you traded those two around, but I do think that the Packers and Lions are kind of superior at the running back position to the other two teams right now. Moving to wide receiver, I am going to put the Vikings at number 1, and I definitely understand the argument that the Bears could be number 1 in this category. You've got 3 guys that were really, really dangerous. I do really love, Justin Jefferson is the best wide receiver in the NFL, and I don't think it's really even all that close. Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams, a lot of those guys are fantastic, but I would say Justin Jefferson is comfortably the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL for me personally, so I think that is the trump card in this case. Jordan Addison was a great number 2. He had a very productive season. Brandon Powell was kind of a nice little gadget player as well in the slot, so, I totally understand that the Bears are 3 deep, while maybe the Vikings are just 2, but you have the proven talent of Justin Jefferson, who is just so dominant, and Addison was great as well. But that doesn't diminish from what the Bears have. DJ Moore was a great trade for them. He was a true number 1 wide receiver in a pretty bad passing offense last year, even still. You trade for Keenan Allen, who I definitely think is on the downswing of his career. He's not the same type of player that he once was, but he's kind of that really good slot option. He's a reliable underneath route runner. He still has a ton of value. I definitely think that him and Caleb Williams will have a very good rapport. And then Rome Odunze, I think, is the perfect complement to that. He's the big contested catch X guy. I think he's a good route runner, really good athlete. He was a top 7 player for me in this past draft, so getting him, where they did was great. And I think he's going to be an excellent player. We just need to see it on the field, but the Bears definitely have a lot of talent in that wide receiver room, and aren't far removed from having like Equinemius St. Brown as their number 1 wide receiver with Byron Pringle. So big upgrades in that regard. And then we're going to put the Lions at number 3. This is a really good division for wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown truly is just the epitome of reliable from the slot. Third down, like 3rd and 5, I feel like every single time I look at a Lions game, Amon-Ra St. Brown is picking those up, and he's consistently settling into the soft zones of defenses. He's just so instinctual in that regard, and it's really impressive. Jameson Williams needs to figure it out. He is a lot of talent. He was a first-round pick, but, he has struggled with drops, injuries, suspensions, whatever it is. He does need to be better in that regard. Then you have Khalif Raymond. They ended up losing Reynolds, who was a big player for them last year, so I don't think it's a super deep room, unlike kind of the Packers, who we're going to talk about next, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is just truly a weapon in that room. And then the Packers, there was a lot made out of kind of the lack of stars in the wide receiver room for the Packers and how Jordan Love would mesh with them. They were great. Christian Watson was dealing with injuries pretty much the whole year, but Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, you've got just so many guys that are contributors in that room and really very solid players. Bo Melton has turned into a nice player as well. You've got really solid players kind of 5-6 deep in that wide receiver room, you maybe don't have a true star. I mean, I think there's some really good talent, Reed and Dobbs, both really young players, Watson as well. I think they can continue to develop for sure, but right now there's just proven wide receivers on all three of the other teams that are like true number one dominant receivers. The Packers just don't necessarily have that, so that puts them at number 4 there. Then moving to tight end, another really good tight end division, and this is also very tough. TJ Hawkinson and Sam Laporta, both excellent players, and Hawkinson I am going to put number 1. He has just done it a little bit more consistently over time. I think he's a slightly better blocker as well. He did not have the touchdown numbers that Laporta did the past year. Laporta had 11, and he also had more yards as well. I mean, Laporta was a crucial part of that offense, and I think obviously Hawkinson is as well, but he's the number 3 target for the Vikings. I think Laporta is really number 2 for him, so I do really, really like both of these guys. I think Laporta could definitely turn into a top 5 tight end. Right now, I think Hawkinson is around number 5 in the NFL, so both of those guys are excellent. I could see the argument flipped either way. It's just, Hawkinson has shown he can do it consistently, and, that means a lot as well, especially at the tight end position where, numbers aren't always the most reliable, or you're not always able to have super consistent numbers unless you're a really good player, and Hawkinson has had that. So I am going to give him the slight edge there. Then we have the Bears up next. Cole Kmet, after kind of having a really rough start to his career, has turned into a really good player for them. You also have Gerald Everett, who you bring over from the Chargers. He's a nice number 2 tight end. Both of those guys, totally fine. Cole Kmet, he is a really good blocker. He's turned into a nice yak guy as well. I think you could do a lot worse than those two in that room. And then for the Packers, Luke Musgrave did deal with some injuries. Tucker Kraft, another mid-round tight end pick that they had. I really liked that pick when they made it. Both of those guys are just not super proven at this point. I like them. I think they have talent, but very clearly for me at number 4 behind some of the more proven receiving talent at the tight end spots, kind of similar to wide receiver there. Moving to the offensive line, I am going to have the Lions at number 1. I do think that they've kind of shuffled some things around, maybe don't have the same depth and true strength of the offensive line that they once had. You did lose Jonah Jackson. I think that was kind of a big loss, but Taylor Decker you still have. He's super reliable, been there for a long time. Frank Ragnow, same thing. Penei Sewell has turned into probably the best right tackle in the NFL. He's definitely a top 10 tackle in the league. Then you bring in Kevin Zeitler. He's been really reliable. Graham Glasgow, probably going to get the start at left guard. He's another guy that has been pretty consistent when he's been called on. He's kind of been a hybrid player, doesn't start super consistently, but he's a solid player for them. Then you drafted Giovanni Manu and Christian Mahogany. Both, I think, are really interesting swings as well. So maybe we don't have a ton of depth on that offensive line, but I do really like the starting 5, and it is one of the better units in the NFL in that regard. So I am going to have them at number 1. Then at number 2, I am going to go with the Packers. The Packers just seem to churn out great offensive linemen and really put them in positions to be successful. Zach Tom, I think, is a really good starter at right tackle. He has just great athleticism. He's a really, really nice player at that right tackle spot, and he has true almost 5 position versatility as well. So you can move him around if guys get hurt, whatever you need. Elton Jenkins, kind of same thing, super versatile. I think he's really talented when he plays as well. Josh Myers is okay. He hasn't been the guy that they hoped he would be, especially drafting him over Creed Humphrey, but still a solid player. Then you have Rasheed Walker, who is a 7th round pick out of Penn State at left tackle. He was kind of called into emergency action and ended up playing pretty well, which I think was surprising for a lot of people, but he's talented and, he was raw coming out, but he showed a lot of flashes. And if anybody can get the most out of him, it's probably the Packers. Then Jordan Morgan, who will probably play guard. I was a little lower on Morgan. I just didn't really see his ability to play tackle. I had a little bit of strength concerns at guard, so we'll kind of see how that goes. I do think that he has the athleticism, that he can mirror guys really well and have success in that regard, but I'd be curious to see how he does on the move to the interior. You also have Royce Newman, Sean Ryan, Andre Dillard, some decent depth on that offensive line as well. So it's not nearly as consistent or star-studded as the Lions starting 5, but I do think it has some talent. Then we're going to go with the Vikings up next. The Vikings are kind of the opposite, where they have some really, really good players, and then they also have some guys that are really big weaklings as well. I mean, Christian Darrisaw, one of the better tackles in the NFL. He has really developed into a great player. Brian O'Neill is another really good tackle as well. He's put on a lot of weight over his career, and he hasn't lost a lot of athleticism. I really like Brian O'Neill and Darrisaw kind of bookending these tackle spots. Dalton Risner, when he's played, has been pretty good as well. Garrett Bradbury, decent player. Really, the main concern is Ed Ingram. He's been just atrocious ever since he was way overdrafted in the second round. Maybe, they are able to find some success moving other guys around and in there, but I don't love Ed Ingram. I do think he's a weak link in this starting five, but you do have some real star-studded talents, especially at the tackle spot. That puts them just above the Bears, who I think are kind of similar to the Packers, where they don't have anybody that's super amazing. I thought Darnell Wright played pretty well at right tackle, and he was their first-round pick, top 10 pick last year. Tevin Jenkins, when he's able to stay healthy, which is so rare, is a really good guard, but the rest of this offensive line's fine. Braxton Jones is an okay left tackle. You drafted Kieran Amagaji, who might be the long-term answer at that spot, but he's coming out of Yale. He is still very raw as a prospect. Ryan Bates hasn't started super consistently. He'll most likely be their starting center. Nate Davis is their current right guard. He's been dealing with a lot of off-the-field issues last year, so we'll see how all of that kind of shapes out. On paper, it's a fine offensive line. There's nothing really wrong with it. And you have other guys. Larry Borum was a decent swing tackle as well. You have guys that can fill in and maybe be successful. I just don't think it's a super high-end unit either, but you could do a lot worse. I definitely still think it's a top 20 offensive line in the NFL. It's not one of the worst by any means. This division just has pretty good offensive lines. At the edge rusher spot, this was a very difficult kind of position for this division. I do like a lot of the players that each team does have. I did decide to go with the Packers at number 1. They just have a lot of production at that spot. Preston Smith had 11 sacks last year. I was really surprised when I saw that. I thought he had a good year, but not quite that good. And, obviously sacks aren't everything, but those are impressive numbers. Rashawn Gary had double-digit sacks as well. I think he's a really good player, especially, when he's able to stay healthy. I would say, he is maybe the best edge rusher in this division, but that's a lot of talent there. You also have Lucas Van Ness, who I thought kind of flashed, and he was really raw coming into the league, but I do still think that there's some talent there. Kingsley Enagbare, he has shown some things as well, so I do really like kind of their starting guys. They've got some decent depth as well, so that's why I ultimately do have the Packers at number 1. At number 2, I have the Lions. Aiden Hutchinson really kind of turned into that dominant top 5 pick that they drafted him to be. He had a fantastic year, double-digit sacks. There were certain games that he was just wrecking pretty much every third down, every obvious passing situation. He was getting after the quarterback. I think he'll continue to ascend and be a great player for them. They also bring in Marcus Davenport, who has dealt with a ton of injuries. When he's healthy, he's still a really solid player. He can give you some explosiveness, some burst. He has some good tools as well. So you've got those guys. And then you also have Josh Paschal, who's kind of a hybrid 5-tech kind of player. James Houston, who 2 years ago was one of the most efficient pass rushers when it came to sacks and pressures compared to the number of snaps played. He didn't do a lot last year due to injuries, but I really think Hutchinson kind of holds this group together. Davenport, you have a lot of upside with. Paschal, James Houston, those guys can certainly contribute. Kaminsky as well. So that's what's going to put the Lions as number 2. I have the Vikings at number 3. And I think that this one is very interesting. Jonathan Grenard, you bring over, you lose Danielle Hunter, but Grenard had a great year with D'Amico Ryans in Houston. He put up fantastic numbers. Andrew Van Ginkel, who you bring in from Miami, he actually was a really highly rated player according to PFF. Had a 91.1 PFF grade, 90.6 pass rush grade. Obviously, that's not everything, but he had 8 sacks. He was very productive, and especially when Chubb and Jalen Phillips went down, he was able to find success. So I think those two are really solid players. And then you bring in Dallas Turner as well, who I think had the highest upside of any of the players in this draft at the edge rush spot. You traded up to ensure that you get him. So I think that there's a lot of potential. I think you've got 3 really good edge rushers in this room. And then you've got some other guys, Jihad Ward, Andre Carter, Pat Jones, that can contribute as well. So I think that is a pretty good group. And then last we have the Bears, which seems pretty crazy because Montez Sweat was so good last year. I mean, he had 8 sacks with Washington before he got traded, and then he had 8 more sacks once he got traded to the Bears. So 16 sacks over the course of the entire season. He was just an amazing acquisition for them. Besides that, they still don't have a ton at the edge rush position. I mean, obviously, he's great, but then you have DeMarcus Walker, Dominique Robinson, Jacob Martin, Austin Booker, who drafted out of Kansas this year. Super raw player, but has some potential. I mean, I think Montez Sweat is great. I don't love the talent around him, and I just think that the other rooms in this division have a couple more guys that can really beat you, where I feel like for the Bears, it really is just the one right now. Moving to the interior defensive line, at number 1, I do have the Detroit Lions. Lee McNeil had already kind of ascended into a really good player for this team. And then you bring in DJ Reader as well, who, when he's healthy, is still one of the best run stuffers in the NFL. He has had some issues doing that in Cincinnati. That's a huge reason why they ended up letting him go. But, you pair him with Lee McNeil, you still have Onwuzurike, Broderick Martin, Mekhi Wingo, who a lot of people liked out of LSU. I was a little lower on him, but that's some really good talent in the interior room. You've got just guys that can get after the quarterback. You've got true run stuffers as well. So I do really like this interior room for the Lions. Then we have the Packers up next. Kenny Clark is not the same player that he once was. He's still really, really good, but he's not the same dominant kind of player. You also have Devontae Wyatt, who has just flashy plays here and there. He's a very up and down interior player, which isn't always the best thing, but he's still disruptive. He can do some things here and there. Then you have Carl Brooks, who was a really nice surprise out of Bowling Green. A lot of people really liked him. And as a 6th-round pick, I thought he showed some nice pass rushing upside. You have TJ Slayton, Jonathan Ford, other guys in that room, which, it's not amazing, but it's a perfectly fine room with some upside, and Wyatt and Brooks in particular, who you're hoping can continue to ascend. Then I have the Bears, Andrew Billings, Gervon Dexter. I think both of those guys are perfectly fine. There's nothing that's super exciting about them. Dexter showed flashes. I think a down-to-down consistency, he still needs to get a lot better. Had a 36 run defense grade, but he did show some flashes, especially in the pass rush game. Had 4 sacks, so I think he can continue to ascend, but Andrew Billings is kind of your true run-stuffing nose tackle. Zach Pickens didn't show a lot his rookie year, but you still have him in that room, who was a 3rd-round pick. So not a ton that you're super excited about, but there's some decent players in that room. And then lastly, we have Minnesota, who they don't have a lot in this room. Jerry Tillery as a starter, is not a great start. He is one of the worst run-defending interior players that I've ever seen. Harrison Phillips is a pretty solid player. You have Jonathan Bullard. Those are fine. Jaquelin Roy. There's nothing that's super exciting in that room. Harrison Phillips by far the best, and he definitely can be a decent player from time to time, but there's just not a lot that's super exciting in that room that makes me feel like they're going to be super hard to run on, or that they're going to get a lot of pressure at the middle at the quarterback's face. So that's what puts them at number 4 there. Then we have the Bears going to be the first team with the linebacker unit here. Tremaine Edmonds maybe didn't have an amazing year, especially for how much the Bears are paying him, but TJ Edwards did. He was fantastic and well worth the money that he got from the Bears last offseason. Jack Sanborn, a undrafted free agent a few years ago, he's been really solid for them as kind of that just 3rd linebacker. You have Noah Sewell. Those guys are all solid. I mean, Edmonds and Edwards, those guys are one of the better, duos in the NFL. Even if Edmonds wasn't as kind of good as they had hoped, he's still a really solid player, and Edwards was arguably a top 10 linebacker in the NFL last year. So I thought he showed some really nice things. And then that brings us to number 2 in this category. That's going to be the Vikings. Blake Cashman was a big signing for them. You bring him over from Houston, where he had a career year. I remember being super high on Blake Cashman when he was coming out of Minnesota back multiple years ago in the draft. Had injuries, was never really able to figure it out until D'Amico Ryans got a hold of him, and he just had a complete breakout season. He was awesome for them. Ivan Pace was an undrafted free agent out of Cincinnati. He's undersized, but he's a great blitzer, and he's super effective in the pass rushing role. Brian Asamoah hasn't turned into the player they had hoped, but it's still a pretty solid group there in that linebacker room. And then we have the Lions at number 3. Jack Campbell definitely did not have the year that they had hoped for after drafting him as early as they did, but they did get some decent play out of Anzalone, Derek Barnes, Reeves Maven, still there, Malcolm Rodriguez. He's still a fun player in that room. So you've got guys. I mean, I don't think that any of them are true difference makers. Anzalone, Barnes, those guys are fine, but they're not really scaring anyone on the opposing side of the field. They will usually get the job done. They're not complete liabilities, but I wouldn't say they're much more than that. And then we have the Packers at number 4. I think Quay Walker is not very good. He has flashes from time to time. He's athletic, and so that allows him to be around the ball from time to time. I still just don't think that his play diagnosis is super fantastic. Was just an outrageous overdraft in the first round. But Edgerrin Cooper, I did really like that pick. He was the most Packers linebacker I've ever seen. He is long, athletic. He will go up and blitz. He's effective in the running game. He was my linebacker 1 in this draft. And, we haven't seen him play a snap, but I do believe that he is going to be a really good player. So I do think they certainly have potential to climb up this list pretty quickly. But right now, the Packers are going to be at number 4. There's not much behind those two guys. Isaiah McDuffie, Tyron Hopper. Those guys are kind of whatever. So that it puts the Packers at number 4 there. Then at corner, it's definitely going to be the Bears. I mean, Jalen Johnson was probably the best cornerback in football when you look at the stats last year. He was a true shutdown player. So at the very least, you have that dominant corner 1 that can match up against the best receivers in the NFL. And then I also thought that Tyreek Stevenson showed some great things. I mean, there was inconsistencies, don't get me wrong. He was grabby from time to time, but his physical press man kind of attitude, I really like that. Kyler Gordon, much better in the slot this year than he was kind of as a rookie. So I think you've got 3 really talented young players in that room. And, I definitely think they have the best corner room in this division. But I do like what the Lions have as well. You go up and get Terrion Arnold in this draft. I wasn't as high on Terrion Arnold as some people were, but I think that where they got was very appropriate value. Carlton Davis, he was always a nice 1-2 punch with Jamel Dean in Tampa Bay, so I think he's a solid player. Emmanuel Mosley, he had an injury in the first game of last season, so he never really got a chance to show what he could do, but he was pretty good in San Francisco back when the Lions signed him at first, so be curious to see what that looks like. Brian Branch, their nickel corner, he was awesome. You have Ennis Rakestraw, who you drafted, Amik Robertson, who I like. Is it just a very deep cornerback room? I think, one of Arnold or Rakestraw, one of those guys, Carlton Davis, will be very successful this year. And then, Brian Branch, those are some just good players in the back end of that secondary. Then I have the Packers at number 3. Jair Alexander is still a really solid corner. I think that he needs to prove that he can get back into that top 10, top 5 conversation where he was even just a year ago, because I don't think he had as good of a year as he certainly had hoped. Eric Stokes is just such a question mark at this point, has dealt with a lot of injuries, a lot of inconsistent play. The talent's there, but it's just not consistent. You have Carrington Valentine, who I thought played decently. You have Corey Ballantyne, and then Keyshawn Nixon, who is an amazing returner, but he's not an amazing corner necessarily. So there's definitely some question marks behind Jair, who definitely needs to show that he's still kind of that dominant corner 1 that he once was. And then the Vikings at number 4, they've definitely upgraded this position. Byron Murphy is a decent player. They brought him in from Arizona last year. Then you also have Shaq Griffin, Caleb Evans, Mekhi Blackman. I still have hope for Andrew Booth, but I mean, he was a second-round pick, and he is slowly falling down the depth chart. He's just dealt with so many injuries. I was super high on him, but I just don't know that it's going to happen if it hasn't already. I did like the Kerry Jackson pick out of Oregon. I think they've upgraded this room, and Brian Flores very, very highly values this position. So I think that they will look to continue to upgrade it as long as Brian Flores is there. But it's a decent unit. It's just not as good as some of the other teams in this division who all have really pretty good corners. Then we have at safety the Bears at number 1. Kevin Byard, he wasn't quite the player that I think the Eagles hoped they were trading for when they got him, but he's still really solid. Jaquan Brisker, I think, is a good instinctual player. He can kind of come up and do a lot of different things. He can rush the passer, he can drop into zone, he can man up tight ends. I think he is a really good, versatile player as well. You have Jonathan Owens as well, who you bring in from the Packers. That's a decent safety room, and I do like the two starters there, even if Byard needs to show that he can bounce back and be one of the best center fielder, safeties in the NFL like he was just a few years ago. Then we have the Packers at number 2. Xavier McKinney was truly an amazing player for them last year. He was really, really good. Javon Bullard was a rookie out of Georgia. We'll see how he is. I do think that he can be a really good player. The safety room looks completely different than it did last year, so definitely some moving parts. But McKinney was an awesome signing. I think he'll plug and play and be a great player right away. And then Bullard, I do have faith, will be a really good player once he kind of gets settled in the system as well. So I do have the Packers at number 2. Then at number 3, I am going to go with the Vikings. I think that Harrison Smith is not the same player that he once necessarily was, but he still is really instinctual. He's just so smart back there, even if the athleticism isn't what it once was. And then Cam Bynum is kind of a do-it-all player as well. I think he's turned into a really solid piece for them. I mean, obviously Lewis Cine is the big question mark here. He's kind of the third stringer according to the Our Lads depth chart. So that's obviously not a good sign for a first-round pick who took just a few years ago, but he has just not turned into a good player at all. He has not shown anything. So right now it's Smith and Bynum. We'll see kind of how that goes. And then we have the Lions at number 4. I really like Kirby Joseph, but he is inconsistent. He reads offenses really well, but there are some inconsistencies in his coverage and things like that. Melifonwu moving over from corner to safety. I think we'll continue to see that development play out, but right now I do have the Lions at number 4 in that regard. And that brings us to the coaching staff, which I think all 4 of these coaching staffs have been really solid. They've improved over time, and I think there's great assistants as well. So I'm going to put the Lions at number 1. Dan Campbell is an awesome, awesome coach. His leadership style is amazing. I think he is just a coach that so many people respect. They want to play so hard for him. He's the great CEO type. Ben Johnson, they convinced to stay once again. Pretty much everybody assumed that he was going to leave for the Washington job. He ends up not. Aaron Glenn's still there as well. This is just a truly well-built staff. They've been able to retain those 3 guys for a couple seasons now, and I think it's one of the best coaching staffs in the NFL. Then I'm going to have the Vikings at number 2. Kevin O'Connell, I think, has done wonders with the offense. He makes it really quarterback-friendly. I think he is great at scheming up great opportunities for Justin Jefferson, who's always facing double coverages. He's still able to find ways to get him open, to use the other weapons on the field as well. Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson. I think he needs to get the run game going, but I think a huge part of that was just Alexander Mattison was really bad for them this past year. But it's all the offense is really, really good, but Brian Flores at defensive coordinator I think is awesome as well. His aggressive, blitz-heavy scheme, press man, that's just stuff that you love to see. He plays defense the way that I want to see defense played. So I definitely respect Brian Flores' defensive play calls and, kind of how he goes about it. So I do really like this coaching staff. I wouldn't be surprised if Flores gets another opportunity to be a head coach at some point as well. So it's really the assistant staff that brings him over Matt LaFleur here. LaFleur has had some really, really good offenses, and he deserves a ton of credit for what he's been able to do with Jordan Love as well. I think that the defensive coordinator position has been just a mess for them for a while. They probably had the worst defensive coordinator in the NFL in Joe Barry for many years, and they finally decided to fire him, get Jeff Hafley. We just got to see it play out because I think they can be really good in that regard with Hafley at the helm, but we just need to see it because their defense has been so much worse than their roster would suggest for a few years now. And then we have the Bears last. Eberflus, I do like. I think he started to show some really good things with his defense last year. They turned the corner and became a really solid unit in the second half of last year. The offensive play calling under Luke Getsy was terrible. I mean, it didn't help. I don't think Justin Fields is, going to be a NFL quarterback at this point, at least a starting one. So I don't think he was helped out by that, but Getsy's play calls were really bad. So they bring in Shane Waldron. I think that can be a big improvement, but we'll just kind of have to play it out and see how that offense looks, obviously with Caleb Williams now there. So that's what the coaching looks like. Let me know what you think about the NFC North here. This is a really talented division, and there's a lot of kind of contentious positions here. These teams are really, really close when it comes to their kind of roster talent. You've got up-and-coming teams. You've got really, really good, talented Super Bowl contending teams as well. So I think this is a very fun division. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you like this kind of content, please hit the like button. While you're down there, hit the subscribe button as well. Just helps push this video out to other NFL draft fans like yourself and truly means the world to me. It helps support the channel, so I would truly appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.